Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pitts. This is Ukraine War News Extra, giving you a little bit more context into the war in Ukraine. And we're going to go through another interview that I think is a pretty decent interview here. Victoria Derbyshire from BBC Newsnight with Carla Sands, the America First policy, a real Trump sort of think tank, effectively a spokesperson of Trump. I think she had worked as an ambassador for Trump in a previous administration, possibly. But anyway, rather like Julia Hartley-Brewer, who took apart Richard Tice, this isn't quite so visceral as that one, but this is a pretty decent interview, as this source says. Victoria Derbyshire shreds Carla Sands, the America First Policy Institute, in a spectacular interview. This war wouldn't have started if Russia hadn't invaded its independent sovereign neighbor. Absolutely, for sure. So I'm going to let this video mainly play through. I will interrupt it occasionally. Let's go over to I used to listen to Victoria Derbyshire heaps when I was doing a lot of driving for a job that I had previously. Did a lot of listening to 5 Live, and she was one of the 5 Live presenters there. Anyway, yeah, here she is with Carla Sands.
To President Trump's former ambassador to Denmark, Carla Sands, now Vice President at the America First Policy Institute, which is a Trump-aligned think tank. Thank you very much for talking to us, Carla Sands. I don't know if you were able to hear the former Ukrainian Prime Minister, but some Ukrainians absolutely worry that they are being cut out of this process. Is that true? And if it isn't, what can you say to reassure them?
You know, what I can say, and I'm pleased to say it, is that the killing is going to stop. That's the good news.
That wasn't the question.
We're finally at the table and talking. The US and Russia, our leadership, hadn't been talking for 3.5 years. And this war never would have started without weak leadership in the White House, without Joe Biden and Kamala Harris being in the White House.
I'm going to interrupt there. This war wouldn't have started if Russia hadn't invaded its independent sovereign neighbor.
You know, when I look at this, and I'm not speaking for the administration, I know the U.S. wouldn't tolerate having troops on our northern border or our southern border in opposition to us. So I'm not giving the Kremlin a pass in any way, but I'm saying
it did sound like it.
Yeah, no, that's not true. So don't put words in my mouth. What I am saying is that the U.S. understands the threat on a border. And we also know that the killing has to stop on both sides. I support what Marco Rubio, our Secretary of State, Mike Waltz, and Steve Witkoff, the special envoy, are doing, working with Russian leadership to get a peace deal. And this is a peace deal that's 3.5 years too late. It should never have happened. This war would never have happened with a strong president. And I will say this, and I really speak from the heart now to the UK, to the EU, work with Trump. Work with Trump. Let's bring peace to the world, and let's have shared prosperity.
Okay,
can I ask? The free speech that's away in the EU and the UK is tragic, and it's going to lead to anti-democracy throughout our greatest allies' region. So I really hope that there will be a change.
Right. You may not have heard, but a former Conservative Prime Minister who stood shoulder to shoulder with a former US President, George H.W. Bush, said at the weekend he found it absolutely odd, was the word he used, that, for example, J.D. Vance, the US Vice President, was talking about a retreat of free speech in Europe and the UK at the same time as cuddling up to President Putin, where if you speak against him, you get put in jail. Where if you oppose his policies, you get poisoned. Where you can be.
I just have to.
And this is something that I don't think mainstream media have said enough. I mean, we've said it, which is J.D. Vance came to the Munich Security Summary, slagged off the EU, slagged off Europe more generally, and in terms of free speech, and didn't slag off Russia in terms of free speech, where you can't say the word war, you have to use the word special military operation, and you are poisoned if you're in opposition, put in prison. There is no free speech. Yet says nothing about Russia and attacks Europe, where all the European countries are above the US, apart from Hungary, on freedom of press index through Reporters Without Borders. Just complete nonsense from J.D. Vance. And here, Derbyshire does a really good job to bring that up. And of course, we're going to hear some ridiculous retort from Carla Sands.
To interrupt you and just say that there are more people in jail in the UK because they spoke what they thought was right or they had interest online than there are in all of Russia.
Oh
there
my goodness, I don't know where you've got that from. I've got a guest here who's laughing his head off at that. Can I
love that. It's just I don't know where you got that from, and then moving on. I don't know. Would I dismiss that out of hand like that? Or I think if I was interviewing Carla Sands, I'd say, right, we're going to stop this interview now. I want to know where you've got that data from. I want you to tell me how you know that there are more people in prison in the UK for freedom of speech issues than people in prison in Russia. Bearing in mind that Russia has now got more people in prison than during the KGB times. So, I'm guessing you're not only wrong, but you are monumentally wrong, and you are lying to the audience here. Until you can give me actual empirical evidence of your claim, I would like you to take that claim back, and we will not continue this interview any further. I will not continue this interview if you are going to lie to my audience. I think that's how I would do it. I think I love Victoria Derbyshire, and I think she's really robust in this interview. But there's always this demand to go on to the next question. Mehdi Hassan is very good at this. When Mehdi Hassan interviews, he's like, we're not going on until we've sorted this bit out. That's how I would interview for sure.
I just ask you, it doesn't appear so far that any pressure is being put on Russia by the US, certainly not publicly anyway. And last week we heard the US Defense Secretary seeming to be giving Russia much of what they want. And today we hear that the meeting with Sergei Lavrov was positive and upbeat and constructive. Why so amenable to a country that invaded its neighbor and killed tens of thousands of Ukrainians?
You know, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands are dying on both sides. The war,
the old both sidesism, but she's not here admitting that, well, actually the hundreds of thousands that are dying on the Russian side are dying, and indeed the Ukrainian side, because Putin has invaded. It's this both sidesism. Oh no, it's not just the poor Ukrainians, it's the poor Russians. Yeah, but the Russians were the people that invaded. Don't poor Russians me when they were the ones who are the aggressors.
Must end. Bottom line, full stop. And I hear that maybe the UK and France are going to send troops as peacekeepers. That's an interesting idea. And I do hope that the EU tends its garden more in Europe and takes care of Europe's business. The fact that our NATO allies, most of them, can't defend their own territory is really appalling. But it's also scary. It's concerning, because to have an alliance, you have to have capable partners, and we need capable security partners amongst the other NATO ally countries. And I speak about the UK, but I also speak about many other European nations.
And I'll obviously let Victoria speak in a second. I would question that as well, because I've been saying this a lot recently. Yes, Europe hasn't spent enough on defense if you look at things as they are now. And things as they are now is that the US is trying to get out of Dodge, right? But the reason why Europe hasn't spent as much on defense is because the US has been in Europe doing its defense for it, because that's been in the best interest of the US. It also works for Europe as well. But both entities there have gained from the US being in Europe doing the defending, like spending that money. So my answer back to Carla Sands would be, well, yeah, can you just answer me, how many bases does Europe have in the US? How many military bases do we have in the US now? None. Okay. So you've got all these bases in Europe and we have none in the US. Who do you think decided that? Do you think that was a decision from the US, or do you think that we begged and begged and begged for the US to put their bases in Europe? That was a decision for and from the US, because it benefited them strategically. It benefits you, Carla Sands. Your country benefits from having a springboard into the Middle East, power over Europe, and a springboard into Africa, and a springboard into the Caucasus, etc., from these bases in Europe. You get to have nuclear weapons in Europe. So you can wax lyrical about how, or you can whinge all you like about how Europe hasn't paid enough, but how about accepting that actually they haven't paid as much as the US, because the US has ordered NATO and global security in a way that the Europeans aren't doing that, because the Americans want to do that instead, because they get to reap the rewards of doing that. When you understand the post-war security architecture, and then the rebuilding of the countries in Europe, where the European countries needed to physically rebuild their infrastructure, where the Americans didn't. So the Americans could spend more money on their military and their defense, and European countries needed to spend much more money on other things. So the Americans came in, did the defense side of things, because we were fighting an ideological Cold War. And that was an arrangement that worked until it didn't work. And now it doesn't work, because the Americans are like, right, we're not going to do that. We're going to pull out. Okay, so now we need to spend much more. And we accept that. Like, yeah, we now need to spend much more, but we weren't spending much more because you guys were doing the spending, and that was your choice as much as it was our choice. So stop coming around and blaming. Like, people, like, you get British and Europeans blaming Europe for not spending enough. I don't do that blame game. It's like, they weren't spending as much because they deemed it unnecessary at the time for all these reasons, which were valid at the time. You could switch the argument and say, why weren't the US spending as much on welfare and infrastructure as Europe was? Like, you were spending too much on defense. Why weren't you spending as much? So you could switch that argument.
It's a big problem.
Can I ask why President Trump hasn't just said to President Putin, get your troops out of Ukraine? The war would end.
Boom.
I think the war is on the way to ending because of President Trump.
Why do you think he hasn't just said that?
With his great team that he has right now negotiating a peace deal.
Why doesn't he just tell him to get his troops out of Ukraine?
Well, you can say it right now on the BBC. I'm sure he'll hear about it.
Oh, I'm just asking if you had any insight into why he hasn't done that already.
I have not asked him about that.
Okay. Do you think that would be a good idea, maybe?
I think that he is looking at the situation with realistic eyes. I wish the rest of Europe had been looking at it with realistic eyes and making positive moves to end the war quickly. He's only been in office for 3 weeks. They're at the table negotiating a peace deal. That is lightning speed. I hope that the UK and Europe will say, we want to work with President Trump. We want to bring shared prosperity to all of our countries. We want to have shared security. We're going to pull our own weight, and we're going to work with President Trump to make each individual country great. Because to have great, strong economic allies and strong security allies makes us all stronger and makes the world a safer place, a better place for each of our citizens. So I hope that there will be a change of heart, and that the opposition and the pettiness that I see coming out of Europe will change, so that Europe will look to its own best interests and say, we want to work with President Trump. I think the greatest president in the modern age. He's going to go down in history as one of the greatest political figures in world history. Please understand that.
Thank you very much for talking to our UK audience, Carla Sands. Thank you very much.
I think there's a pretty good interview there, but I would have just gone to town on Carla Sands, and I'd be calling out the pettiness there that she claims of Europe. I'm like, really? You think Europe's been petty? Have you heard your thin-skinned president? Have you heard him? Like, this is just sheer projection. The pettiness is not coming from Europe, believe you me. So I think that was a good interview. I think Victoria Derbyshire is a seasoned interviewer. She's decent, but like with all mainstream media interviewers these days, you have a set of questions, and then because you've got those questions down, you think you have to ask them all. And you're like, we've got to do this. Okay, next question. I'd always be like, mate. We're staying on this point. And if we have to stay on this point for the entire interview, we'll stay on this point for the entire interview, because I am not letting you get away with lying to my audience. Anyway, let me know what you think. Take care, guys. Speak to you soon.